I appreciate everybody joining our webinar around private label. We're excited to talk with you about private label, about the difference between private label shoppers and national brand shoppers. For today, we'll go through a quick high-level view of what we're going to be digging into. Our plan is to give a brief introduction on what we do at Shopper Intelligence, walk through a little bit of what makes us unique, the research that we do, why we have a unique view into the private label shopper and the national brand shopper. We'll dive into who is the private label shopper, what makes them unique versus the national brand shopper. That's the neat thing of our data is we can segment and isolate those shoppers to understand what makes them so different and unique, and then we can build customized strategies based off of that. So we'll be exploring that at great length over the next 40 minutes. We're going to end it with what are those things that retailers and private label suppliers should be focusing on around private label at a very high level, and then also the national brands. What should national brands be doing to focus? Certainly, every brand has a role within the retailer, and it's good to know what those levers are. At the end, we'll have a quick Q&A. My name is Jason Smith. I lead the U.S. team at Shopper Intelligence. I've managed category management teams at Hormel Foods, at Colgate-Palmolive, and at dunnhumby. A lot more of my background's on the manufacturing side, working in category management, working with a lot of the different tools. I'm excited to talk about what we have today and also hopefully how it applies with your day-to-day job, because for many of you, I've done a similar role in my past life. Erica, if you want to introduce yourself.
My name is Erica Reed. I've been with Shopper Intelligence about 2.5 years, although I've worked with them for several years prior to that as well. When I worked at Bayer, I've worked across lots of different categories as a category manager, as well as a category strategy manager, creating visions. I've also worked at an online retailer across lots of different categories, and both the manufacturer, retailer side and agency side. I am happy to answer any questions that you might have after this as well regarding any of your particular categories or brands.
I'll kick off the first section, and then Erica's going to take the reins, and I'll end the presentation with some takeaways and different pieces. When you look at the data, there'll be some interesting data points that potentially you might have already felt or known about. We're hoping that you see some things that you might not have known about the private label shopper and learn a few tips and tricks on potentially things to focus on. We'll have a couple slides on what we do at Shopper Intelligence. We're a market research company that focuses on understanding the shoppers. What makes us unique is we do a large-scale survey where we've standardized a lot of the questions that we ask across the different retailers, different categories, and that enables us to benchmark, compare, and rank across everything in our database. We not only know how your category performs at a retailer, but how it benchmarks and compares across the entire store, the entire website, but also across dozens of other competitive retailers to know what's unique at that particular retailer. Our data is used to build more shopper-centric strategies, both internally, you think of channel strategies and headquarter planning. Having the right data to understand where to prioritize your strategies is very important. At the headquarters, we can help you think of the 4 Ps. We fuel a lot of those insights into understanding price, promotion, placement, and product. A lot of our data it perfectly fits into that. So you can understand like what are those things that I need to be focusing on. In the bigger picture, it's meant to help manufacturers and retailers and even shoppers, since we're shopper-centric, really focusing on the shopper. That's where the retailer and the manufacturer intersect. That's where we, with our data, can add a new lens and understanding of who the shopper is and what's really important to them. What are some of the insights that we're going to dig into? And you'll see some of these during the webinar. Some of these you won't, because we obviously are diving into one particular topic. But we have, generally speaking, some of the things that we are capturing. We have a section called Category DNA, where we look into the role of the category within the context of the retailer. That's where, because what we're currently tracking about 118 categories, having that defined role and the benchmark and the comparison to all the rest of the store is very valuable. We understand the shopper's wants and needs, so what's important to them, how satisfied is the shopper at that retailer. We'll dig into a number of nuggets a little later, understanding what's really important to the shopper and that's shopper satisfaction, especially around price. Then we also have a really good idea around the shopper's path to purchase, what triggers them to buy, what were they planning to buy. Promotionally, are promotions able to drive conversion or drive units, getting people to trade? These are things that by talking to shoppers and understanding their motivations and drivers, we can really understand how to best push the category forward. And then the last piece is shopper profile. This is a catch-all of a lot of different questions that we're digging into, but we have a full understanding of the profile of the shopper. We also add a lot of new questions over time. So certainly what makes us unique is the fact that we have been tracking a lot of these categories for many years, but sometimes we add new questions. A couple of years ago, we asked some new questions around the impact of inflation to understand that. We just added a question last quarter about understanding GLP-1 drugs and the impact that it's having, especially some of the food and snacking categories. These are more relevant topics that might not have been relevant a few years ago. We certainly try to track things over time, but we definitely add things over time depending on how things change. I briefly mentioned this, but we track about 150,000 shoppers. That's how many people we talk to about on an annual basis. And this is across all of these retailers. There's about a dozen channels that we're tracking. And at most retailers on the list, especially the Walmart, the Costco, the Amazon, we're tracking over 100 categories within that retailer. Because we ask similar questions, we're able to rank categories, rank brands, rank segments. That makes it very powerful of understanding, especially from the retailer view, how to manage the overall business. But because we cover such a wide range, if we were digging into a particular category, we'd be able to understand how it's different within Walmart, grocery, dollar, and be able to benchmark across different retailers, it's very powerful. I think of my time working in leakage data and panel data, where the fact that you can show how all the retailers are interacting, it's very powerful to benchmark and to compare them. Then some of the categories that we are tracking, which a lot of the slides that we'll show today, we're going to be highlighting all of our field work that we completed through the March of this year. You'll see a 1-year view of 117 categories that we tracked in the US over the last year. And one bit of note, because we drill in particular into one group of categories, and that's actually the household department. A little later, we'll get into some slides and when we reference household, it's a lot of air care, air fresheners, dish care, laundry fabric, and household cleaning, which is surface care. Something to note when we're referencing that a little later, that's the categories. But that's how our data is used, you'll find a little later, is we can drill into a category, we can compare the category, the department, cross departments, cross categories. So very powerful to have that comparison, which is something that you typically wouldn't have when you're looking at shopper data like this. So the one offer we want to mention before we move on is we have actually a tool that we've developed over the last year that we're offering up for free to use this year. We're capturing data on the shopper and around what shoppers are saying, as well as publications are saying. And we're aggregating this to come up with different themes on what the shoppers are talking about and the voice of the shopper. If you get a chance, scan the QR code. It's a little bit at a higher level than some of the 117 categories that we track. It's probably a little bit more at that department level. It's something that we're piloting this year and wanted to offer it up to everybody if you wanted to play around with it. It's very powerful to see what are some of those topics. And we have it actually, I think you should be able to see not only the US, but we've also propped up something in Australia as well as the UK. So you can look at some global data as well. To kick things off, we learned a lot about the private label shopper digging into this. When we capture our data and the methodology in terms of the data that we capture, all of the data that we capture is captured through an online survey. So we find shoppers, we find out what they bought, when they bought it, and where they bought it. If it's at a category and at a retailer that we care about, and they bought it in the last week, then they would go through a survey about that last category purchase they made at the retailer. So that's a little bit of the context of the field work that we do. When we're talking about private label shoppers, those are shoppers that bought private label in one of the 117 categories that we're tracking. Obviously, we're rolling it up to a big number, but obviously we can break it down, and we will break it down in a few of the slides. So hopefully you're able to see that in the next couple of slides. Some of the things that we know about the private label shopper. Now, this is one footnote. You'll see that we have a little index in here. And so the index that you see is the index of private label versus the category average, because obviously not every private label shopper is the same, but certainly we can see where they might skew heavily in certain areas. And that's what we're identifying here, that we discovered that certainly there's a lot more of what we call a middle or mature family. So you think of families with children in high school or college or empty nesters, certainly over indexes on over 55, retired, lower income, smaller households, and one that actually I hadn't even really thought about, but I had over-indexed on rural. That national brand shoppers actually skewed a little heavier on A counties and things like that. With our field work, we actually know the zip code and all those details, so we're able to cross-reference where you live and know what you bought. It's fun to see that. This was something that actually I learned as I was building this around the rural shopper, being over-indexing as private label. When we look at so part of our question is, hey, we know what you bought, what you bought, but we also want to know, who did you buy it for? This was more interesting in terms of the index. But when people are buying it when they're buying private label, it over-indexes for general use for the family. We'll talk about household products in a little bit. Household products is one of those categories where you're buying things for household cleaning or laundry. It's for the benefit of the whole family. But you could see over indexes for the whole family, general use within the home, as well as buying for yourself and your spouse and partner. Where national brands over index, which I thought was always interesting, is heavily over indexed when buying for our children, as well as buying for our household pet, which household pet is a category and a department that is heavily national brand focused. But interesting to see that when we're buying for our kids and for our pets, more likely at least over indexing for national brands versus buying for the family. Another question, so as some of these questions that we'll dig into, it'll start to layer in that understanding of private label and where the opportunity lies. A question that we ask, and we know if you bought private label, we know if you bought national brand, but we also want to understand the opportunity of who's really open to buying private label. So one of the questions that we ask is, I'm usually willing to consider a retailer's own label products in the category. We're able to understand what categories are shoppers open to buying private label at that retailer. And again, this data is at a national level, so we're not taking in the channels or the retailers into consideration. But when we looked at which categories show up as, and this is out of 117 categories that we tracked, and all the data that we're looking at today, over the course of the year that we're highlighting, we surveyed about 143,000 shoppers overall in that time period. Out of the 117 categories that we tracked, these are the ones that showed up as shoppers very open to buying private label, which makes sense. Some of these, there's not even a strong private label presence in the category, but a lot of them are that fresh perimeter categories, were certainly what drives a lot of traffic to the retailer. Then the categories that fell pretty far down, which one of them is one that I've worked in my past life with, toothpaste and whiteners. Some of these categories, private label, not as strong. National brands is much stronger presence in the category. But certainly every time we run this report, we typically do it in an individual retailer, because some retailers, toothpaste could work, where in other ones, it might be something that you might want to deprioritize on your list. Okay. We also roll up categories into departments. This one's interesting to know as well, lends itself to some of the ones we were looking at before, but produce, meat, bakery. There's not as much of a national brand presence, where pet care and alcohol, you don't see a lot of private label in there, unless you're going to PetSmart or Petco. But in traditional channels, you wouldn't see quite as much of that. We will be digging into household products actually a little bit later, but it's interesting to note that this is a category that actually private label shoppers are not that open to buying compared to others. But when we look at it a little bit later, there's actually still an opportunity there in certain areas to potentially focus on the categories within household. Now, this is, again, at a 30,000 foot view, which I typically don't like to do this, but it gives us a good barometer of how retailers or how shoppers view a retailer's private label offering in a category. But overall, as we dig into which retailers or which shoppers are open to buying private label at which retailers, we found a common theme around Amazon, Club, Target, and Kroger. There's a little bit more of an affinity to buy private label at these retailers, where if you look at the left side, dollar, drug, convenience, the food, grocery channel, a little less likely. Now, this is heavily dependent on the category. If I think of the drug channel and Walgreens, potentially some of the HBC categories, things like that, there's a lot more trust and efficacy within those categories, where this would look very different. Something more interesting than a so what, but something where certainly some retailers have built a very strong presence in private label. So I'll pass the baton over to Erica.
Thank you, Jason. Next, we're going to look at how people shop private label versus national brands. And one of the first things we are going to look at, which Jason needs to click me on, thank you, is around how planned was it for both private label and national brands. In the blue bars as private label shoppers, and in the orange bars are the national branded shoppers. And what we do is we ask them, did you plan to buy that category pre-trip, or did you decide, in store to buy it? Planned pre-trip is on the left-hand side, and the unplanned sort of impulse in-store purchase planning is on the right-hand side. Normally, you could add together that 81% of private label shoppers were planned pre the trip, and then 16% were unplanned. And what you can also see is that essentially, whichever branded product you look at, planned shops generally always are bigger than those unplanned purchases. Actually, for private label shoppers, you have an over-index of being more planned pre-trip for that category purchase. We also drilled into that a little bit more and try and find out if it was planned pre-trip, then was that part of a regular purchase? So you can actually see that almost 60% of shoppers said that it was a regular purchase. They were on autopilot of those private label planned shoppers. They thought, I'm going to buy whatever I see there as part of my regular purchase that I had pre-planned for that category. Whereas for the national branded shoppers, those were around half of those shoppers. So essentially impacting those, trying to get to those shoppers is much more difficult for the private label shoppers because they're on that autopilot. We also ask shoppers in our survey, what did you plan to buy? So our private label shoppers actually, so on the left-hand side, you can see which the private label shoppers and where they over-index. The private label shoppers over-indexed on saying that they had planned to buy whatever the best price was for that day. Whereas the national brand shoppers were much more, they over-indexed on saying that they planned to buy one or more brands. So they were much more brand focused in their purchase for that planning to buy survey question. What we also found is that private label shoppers were much more likely to say that they wanted to grab and go. So we asked them, how do you prefer to shop the category? So they said the private label shoppers were much more likely to say, I wanted to grab and go because I knew what I wanted or I was under time pressure. Whereas we found that national branded shoppers were much more likely to want to browse. The reason that they said they wanted to browse was because they were uncertain of what they wanted, or they were also interested in the category. Now, obviously, we can also drill that. This is total national brands and total private label, but we can also drill into particular categories for you if you're interested in finding out about that. Obviously, as part of your subscription, you would get all of that as well. One of the other questions we ask is, when did you use or consume your purchase? And there was some significant differences between the private label and the national branded shopper for this as well. So you can see here that the national brand shoppers were much more likely to want to consume the same day. That's that over index there, that 107 that you can see. Whereas the private label shopper, they were more likely to say that they wanted to, that it was for a future consumption purchase. National branded shoppers potentially have also got a little bit more of an expandable purchase, because if you are going to be consuming it the same day, then you're more likely to need more. One of the other questions we ask is around the more I buy, the more I consume. So here you can also see that it's more expandable for the national branded shoppers. So they over-index here on that, on saying that the more they buy, the more they consume, whereas private label shoppers are less likely to say that, and they basically are less likely to. So for them, it's much less expandable in that purchase. Some of the other spend driving questions that we ask shoppers. So here you can see national brands over-index on pretty much all of the spend drivers within a store. So they're more likely to say, they over-index on saying, I often buy extra, I don't mind paying more. They over-index on saying, I am willing to try new, or I buy incrementally because it's new or different. I buy because I feel like it. So there's some significant sort of incremental spend that national brands contribute to categories overall. We also looked at retailer loyalty. One of the questions we offer out to our survey shoppers is, one of the reasons I go to the retailer is because it does this particular category that they've purchased in the last 7 days particularly well. We can get a little bit of a feel for that retailer loyalty. When we rank all of the categories on this particular metric, here you can see the top 10 categories where shoppers have said that they are more likely to go to the retailer because they do that particular category well. Here you can see a lot of these are very private label dominated: fresh seafood, fresh meat, fresh veg, fruit, fresh rolls and bakery goods, but also some more surprising things within there potentially. Vitamins was number 3, and infant and toddler formula number 4, and then diapers and training pants, all part of the baby purchase. On the right-hand side, you can see the bottom 10 categories. And actually, they tend to be more national brand heavy. So like toothpaste and whiteners, gum and mints. So those are more of the bottom categories that potentially are more branded focused. This is the percentage of private label shoppers that said that they were, one of the reasons they go to the retailers because they do the category particularly well. But you can basically see that private label shoppers are much more brand loyal are much more retailer loyal than the national brand focus. So almost 52% of the private label shoppers, so over index compared to national brands. This is the all category average. And then we can just look at this on a category at the department level. We noticed when we were looking at this that household departments that actually particularly over indexed on that private label loyalty. And by the way, our household department is made up of air care, dish and fabric care, laundry detergent, and surface care. But you can see there that heavy over index for private label within that. And then we also can slice it by channels. The highest private label, it was even higher. It was 76% within club, which I think is probably due to the strength of the Kirkland brand. And then also, and it was lowest for food, which was around the 54% mark within household, but still significantly larger than what you can see on average. We thought that was quite interesting. Some of the other questions that we ask shoppers is, how important are particular factors to you when you're buying things, and also their satisfaction, which Jason will delve into a little bit later. But as you can see here, this is the private label shoppers, and what they said to us was particularly important for them. And then we ranked the factors for you. You can see the number one factor for private label shoppers is price. Then we have a few other metrics that also we bucket into that price bucket later on that you'll see for satisfaction. So for example, some of the other factors that are price related is EDLP, which was 6th, and then best value is 7th, and offers is number 11 out of 15 of the 15 that you see here. But actually we track 19 factors in total, but we show you the top 15 here. And then you can see on the right-hand side, the national branded shoppers and those same metrics. So you can see there that price actually came out at number 3. Pretty much all of those kind of price related factors were lower, except offers. So for national brand shoppers, offers actually is more important than it is for the private label shopper. We also track any of those important factors over time. So this is going back a few years, and we were looking at the importance of price over time for the national brand shopper and the private label shopper. What you can see is that for the private label shopper, actually, price has become more important in the last 2 years. So it's up 5.7%, whereas the national branded shoppers over the last 2 years, that importance has increased by 1.4% in terms of what shoppers have said to us. So that private label shopper is becoming more price sensitive. When we delve into that on a household department level, to follow through some of the other things that we were talking about, that household side of things, one of the interesting things that we found was that initially 2 years ago for private label, actually household, for the private label household shoppers, price was not as important as it was for the branded household department shoppers. This is our metric is out of an average out of 5. And so that's the scale that you can see. You can see that over time, actually, the household private label shopper, for them, the price has become more important over time than it has for the national brand household shopper. Some of the other pricing questions that we ask our shoppers is around the role of price and what that plays within the purchase decision. So shoppers can answer limited or no role. There was some role, or it was strong or very strong. And you can see that for the private label shopper, actually, price was, it over indexes for shoppers saying that it was strong or very strong role that price played in their purchase decision. And one of the other questions we ask around, do you look to the price of what you buy in the category that you've purchased to tell me if with the retailer is competitively priced in general? We call this our price beacon question. There are certain categories that really stand out for shoppers when they are trying to decide on that price competitiveness. You can see that private label shoppers a higher percentage of private label shoppers than national brand shoppers say that they are likely to actually assess a retailer on that price competitiveness. That's something else to be mindful of if you're operating within that area.
Thanks, Erica. I will dive into more around shopper satisfaction. This is a high-level overview. If you look at the far left, this is a roll-up of all of the levers that we track, where generally private label shoppers are a little bit more satisfied. the national brand. Not terribly significant, but then as we dig in a little bit deeper to find out what's driving some of that, and Erica mentioned those four different pricing, EDLP, value, and offers. They all fall into this pricing bucket, but that's an area where private label is significantly higher in satisfaction than national brands. Some of the other ones are pretty close. On the far right, execution, this is a little bit more about the ease of shopping the category, limiting out of stocks, finding the category. That as shopper is more satisfied, but it kind of makes sense due to them not browsing, and probably it's a little simpler trip than the national brand. But really, we want to dive into a little bit more around this pricing piece to understand where those opportunities are. Similar chart to what Erica showed before. On this left-hand side, we're showing the satisfaction for private label shoppers in terms of all those top 15 levers to find out how they fall. Now, in the previous slide that Erica showed, price showed up as the most important lever in the category. When we look at how it ranks on satisfaction, it falls middle of the pack. So obviously, this is something that at a high level, again, all categories, all retailers, there's certainly an issue around pricing. And so that's something that certainly we want to address and at least keep focused on. You can see value ended up being a little bit more satisfied. EDLP was even further down around that overall satisfaction around EDLP. That'll come into play a little later on in terms of some recommendations. And then offers. Generally, this isn't as important to shoppers that buy private label, but certainly pretty far down the list. If we look at these same levers and understand how satisfied are the national brand shoppers, you could see that offers went from near the bottom of the list to near the top of the list in terms of satisfaction. National brands do a great job of building excitement and building promotions. You think of the influencers online, there's a lot of different ways that we can engage with shoppers, and national brands, generally speaking, shoppers are a lot more satisfied with that. But when we looked at the big call out on this slide is actually how dissatisfied the shoppers that buy national brand are on price. It showed really far down the list. So certainly something that we would recommend down the line drilling into and figuring out like which categories, which retailers are we really having this issue? Because certainly where it is, if it's very important and the shopper is dissatisfied, that's typically something that we would want to address right away because it's impacting shopper satisfaction, which will impact sales. Okay, a similar chart to what Erica showed. This one is about trending shopper satisfaction on price in national brands and private label. You'll see that over the course of the last, so this is showing 3 years of data, but over the last year, we've seen an uptick versus the previous year on shopper satisfaction. Some of this, a lot of the inflation, a lot of the price increases happened a little bit more than 12 months ago. Certainly there was that initial shock and the perception of the shopper was very negative in terms of price. That it was a big hit to a lot of categories and a lot of satisfaction across almost all retailers that we track. But we have found a normalization of this where prices certainly haven't come down, but the rate of increase on inflation has got closer to what I would consider expected or what's been going on over the last few decades, that average. So we're a little bit closer to the average inflationary rate, which is starting to normalize and people are becoming a little numb to the pricing. But generally speaking, satisfaction has gone back up past the levels from 2 years ago for private labels. Those private label shoppers are actually even more satisfied on price than they were a couple of years ago, where national brand, going back to that previous slide, pricing highly dissatisfied. So that's something that we were curious about as well and wanted to dig into more. When we show that same household, we were talking about household products, so might as well complete the loop on this. But when we look at the overall satisfaction of all national brands and household department and all private label brands and household department, you'll see that at least within household brands, private label is a good case study of that rebound, that hockey stick that is able to rebound from one year to the next. Some of this, obviously, it depends on the retailer, but there's certainly a lot of different ways that we can impact this by not lowering price, but it's around that perception and value of that we're trying to show to the shopper. So what now? We've obviously shown a lot of data points. What we wanted to do is spend a couple of slides to say what we would recommend retailers and private label manufacturers should do to prioritize their private label shopper, and then also what national brands should consider. Now, again, we're going to keep it fairly high level. Hopefully there's some anecdotal things that would be beneficial as you're planning out both private label and national brands. So how best to drive private label? We recommend keeping it simple. Private label shoppers want their purchase decision to be quick and easy, ensure placement is highly visible. Erica was talking about grab and go versus browse. certainly because private label shoppers are more likely to be on autopilot, it's very difficult to disrupt them on their trips. It's about keeping it simple, getting the basics right, and ensuring that you make that trip as easy as possible for the shopper. The next thing is price is the most important lever in the category for private label shoppers. Consider more EDLP. So certainly there has been, it doesn't rank as high on satisfaction as really it should. We would still recommend continuing to focus on price for private label. We did notice that certainly there's a disconnect around EDLP. When shoppers are looking for something quick and easy, an EDLP strategy can be very, very beneficial to that shopper because they don't want to have to think too much and they want to trust that price every day. Depending on the category, depending on the retailer, we see that overall there's a bigger opportunity around EDLP within a lot of these categories. And that's coming straight from the shoppers, what they want and how satisfied they are. Then recommend to target categories within the retailer and channel where private label can add value to the category. Not every category is optimal for private label consumption. So this is where obviously you have access to the overall share of private label, how it's doing. A lot of times what we try to do is try to identify, we'll even drill into brands and segments within a category to find out our shoppers in one segment may be open to private label. And then what would typically happen is we would then recommend expanding assortment within that segment. Because certainly a category can be many things. We always recommend not only drilling into the retailer and channel, but also digging into the category a little bit to find out. I'm using this as an example, but you think of vitamins. There's a ton of different segments within vitamins. The multivitamin would be good for private label expansion, but the brain health wouldn't. That's something that we dig into with our clients to understand where those opportunities and threats are. With national brands, when we were digging into the data, we didn't want it to be about national or private label. Certainly private label is very important to retailers, driving loyalty, driving conversion, ensuring that the shopper doesn't leave the retailer due to price. There's a lot of things that private label is very good at. National brands, as you saw, there's a huge basket building opportunity. Obviously, it builds a lot to the category. So when we think of what we would recommend, we typically focus on differentiation. National brand shoppers are more willing to browse and pay more in the category, an opportunity to drive bigger baskets. So we didn't go into all of our, we could have made this probably a 2-hour presentation digging into some of the weeds, but from our data, we know that people are more promotionally driven on national brands, are willing to buy more for quality or for value. People will be willing to stock up, and being that national brand shoppers there's that immediate consumption and that expandable consumption, the more we can get them to buy more, certainly there's less risk that they'll be taken out of the category. So it builds that overall category by driving more units per trip and dollars per unit, things like that. The second point is national brands drive innovation, excitement, and impulse to the category. Make sure to keep the category top of mind with the shopper. So obviously national brands help bring attention. So we talk about adding theater, doing sampling, doing out of store marketing. How do we draw people to the retailer into our category? That's typically been the national brand's role, is driving that excitement. And so certainly know your role, know where to focus on. And certainly that's where national brands stand out well ahead of private label. And then the last piece is, and this came up, this wasn't actually something we were originally going to dive into, but it was so apparent when we were digging into it, because typically when we're looking at national brands, we're looking within a category, but at a macro level, there's certainly a disconnect on price satisfaction with national brands. The trends are not going in the right direction, and losing ground to private label. So important to consider new ideas to show value to the shopper. This could be promotionally driven. Think of buy one, get one, two furs, trying to show value. There's a lot of ways to show that. Value add packs. There's even different case packs and types and forms that potentially could help drive a better satisfaction overall around that price satisfaction. Hopefully everyone was able to see a few things. Again, we weren't able to drill into every category and retailer, but what we would recommend is that if you have any questions, please email Erica or I. There's also a link on the bottom if you want to book a demo. Email us if you're interested. We'd love to walk you through more about your category, your retailer, because certainly we're scratching the surface on a lot of the data that we have. Wanted to open up the time for any questions that anyone had. Erica, I might check in with you because you might be able to see the chat function.
One of the questions that we had was the level and drilling in and also drilling upwards. This is obviously US data. Can you also look at various countries?
Yes, I didn't mention this, but we have a similar program set up in about a dozen countries. We have a similar one in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, I think a half a dozen European countries. And a lot of our questionnaire, a lot of the things that we're asking, understanding what's important to the shopper and all these different metrics, we ask those similar questions in other countries as well. There's differences. We spell flavor and color differently. And there's we might call something range, or they might call it range. We call it something else. So there's different things that we have layered in with our program, but we do have a number of global clients that actually use us as a global benchmarking tool to really understand shoppers' attitudes and motivations, not only within a market, within a retailer, within a category, but also across different markets. A lot of the different people in different countries, we spend a lot of time showing data on other countries, teasing each other about shopper behavior and things like that. That's a fun part of the data, is you have access to all these different things, and you can find out quirky things about every market, which is fun.
Thank you. There was one more here. I noticed the drug channel ranks lowest in affinity to purchase private label. What can drugstores do to compete with private label in grocery and club?
One bit that I would layer into that is it's a little, the fact that it showed so far to the left, part of that, it's a little bit being penalized in terms of the products that are sold at drug channel versus a food channel. Because as you saw, a lot of the private label heavy categories were meat, produce, bakery, things that Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, that's not a core functionality. So what I would actually do is actually look at a category by category, compare adult pain relief versus adult pain relief to get an apples to apples comparison. Because I think once we drill into, that'll probably be the reason why the drug channel is so far to the left, because of a lot of those categories that are so heavily private label over index in a grocery, a Walmart, and other channels. There are, the interesting thing is though, there's a lot of categories where private label is strong. So it's really focusing on those, prioritizing those, and then looking for how can we incrementally add to the category with private label, not necessarily add it to have it. Can it drive loyalty? Can it drive conversion? Things that we might have been missing out with too heavy of a national brand strategy.
I had one more, which is, how do I address category specific questions within the data?
The questions that we showed today are standard questions that we ask across all categories, but when we typically work with our clients, we add in a lot of custom questions of that individual category. There are times where we might drill into around pet food, understanding the influence of a veterinarian, or we work with a skincare client that wants a deeper understanding around the role of dermatologists and how influential they are. So there's certainly some questions where if we're looking at role or path to purchase, that we can ask that same question across all categories. Other questions when you're drilling into, let's say, the efficacy of certain things within vitamins, it's going to be very category specific. So we're still able to build that into our program. It's certainly not something that you would then compare across the category. I appreciate everyone's time. Hopefully it was a 45 minutes well spent in your day and you're able to see a few things that you didn't know about, which is, it's always interesting when you're looking at data to try to learn a few things, which I know I learned a few things digging into this data with Erica, understanding the private label shopper. But we would, if you're interested, we would certainly love to share more about your category, your retailer. Reach out to us if you have any questions. Anyone that attended the session, we're going to send out a copy of the video as well as a copy of the deck. So you can look at it at a later date and share it internally. Very much appreciate everybody's time and look forward to seeing how the private label shopper evolves over the next year. More to come. Thanks again for everyone's time and hope everyone has a great rest of their day.